Thank you all. So Michael Fresa earlier today emphasized the importance of utilizing cheap student labor. Well, because I'm going to be talking about personal initiative training, despite the title of my slides, you might not realize it, but I'm going to imitate that because I'm the cheap version of Michael Fresa. I want to continue on from his introduction to you in terms of PI and make a case that it is really important in our understanding of how to intervene with social innovation and entrepreneurship. It's a very different perspective on how to scale that sort of change than what we might traditionally approach in a traditional business setting. In a larger, especially a larger business setting when we're thinking about employee performance or issues of productivity. So to get us there, I'm going to introduce a framework that we would typically use to understand how we enhance and how we would scale enhancements to improve productivity in a traditional organization. I'm going to shred that framework, even though I created it, and then I'm going to show you how radical PI really is. It's a type of training that I've come to believe in very strongly through firsthand use of the training, and I've had the privilege of implementing it in 3 countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and in the United States. So let's present a framework that we can understand how to understand the enhancement of productivity in our society, predominantly through the building of skills. This is a framework that I helped to build in collaboration with the United Nations Development Program. And it's essentially a synthesis, a crash course, if you will, in multiple big theories in organizational psychology. At the center of this model is the proposition that skill building, goal setting, and psychological empowerment are closely intertwined, and a lot of research bears this out. These 3 interrelated activities of building skills, setting goals, developing a sense of psychological empowerment are supported then by at least four contextual factors that we can control in an organizational setting. Work design, so how employees' jobs are arranged and the amount of feedback they get regarding their work are 2 examples of how work can be designed. Human resource practices, so this is training and the extent to which employees are allowed to participate in decision making. Leadership, especially the use of excellent leadership techniques like transformational leadership. And then finally, the provision of social and political support resources and then a sense of justice make up this category. These are essentially the ingredients that can help drive this positive work cycle of setting goals, developing new skills, and feeling a sense of psychological empowerment. Nothing controversial about that, and it's definitely not untrue for entrepreneurs that these things are bad, but they're not enough. An entrepreneur, an innovator, ultimately is not the passive recipient of these 4 aspects of support. While funding, like we saw from the Mango Fund, is critically important to the success of innovators, it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. So we have to flip this framework that I so carefully labored over, completely on its head. And instead think of putting PI right at the center of this framework. So here's where self-efficacy would land, by the way, because it's a key component of my talk in just a moment. It's inherent in empowerment. So PI is, again, self-starting, future thinking, and overcoming barriers. And when you put those behavior patterns at the center of an idea of how to capacitate entrepreneurs and innovators, you then have to think not how leadership can be given or work design can be given or human resource practices can be given to the entrepreneur, but instead how that entrepreneur can then affect their own environment. So it flips things on its head. And it's going to be the self-design of organizations. It's going to be the self-acquired financial and social capital that becomes really important, in addition to the financial and social capital that the entrepreneur is bestowed upon by outside groups. And it's the self-guided skill development that becomes critical. Mentorship is going to be important because entrepreneurs are leading themselves, and they're going to require a degree of co-equal leadership with other entrepreneurs to be able to continue to drive this process of self-starting, future thinking, and overcoming barriers, skills and mindsets, because they're really kind of both. We still have empowerment there, and we still have self-efficacy there, but viewing this like we traditionally do as something that we can intervene in can be particularly problematic. Many programs, and I think there's great motivations behind this, try to aim at improving the self-efficacy of entrepreneurs and innovators. And that, again, is not necessarily an inherently negative thing, but there can be major complications. Because if you don't capacitate the extent to which these entrepreneurs can be self-starting or tend to be self-starting, future-thinking, and devoted to overcoming barriers, you can run into some problems. Self-efficacy is a known positive predictor of entrepreneurial success. There are at least 3 meta-analyses that have pointed in that direction. But as an example of the complications that can stem from trying to emphasize just the development of self-efficacy, I have conducted a meta-analysis, and I'll just preview some of the results because they currently have not been published, but I believe they're illustrative. Because if we use gender and gender inequality as kind of proxies for the underprivileged nature of so many entrepreneurs' lives, from lower income settings, from marginalized populations. So if we think of gender as a potential stand-in variable for many entrepreneurs' struggles when they come from marginalized backgrounds, we can think of potentially gender inequality in society as being a limiting factor between self-efficacy and its relationship to entrepreneurial success. So even though we would design an intervention to increase self-efficacy of, for example, female or women entrepreneurs, that might not lead to greater success because of these issues of gender inequality in society. And indeed, that's what we found. In a meta-analysis of approximately 107 independent samples, we found that the relationship represented on the y-axis between entrepreneurial self-efficacy of various types and entrepreneurial success is moderated by a combination of the gender composition of the samples of the studies we looked at and the level of gender inequality in societies. And for this figure, we used 2 levels of gender inequality. High gender inequality, and that's according to the United Nations Development Programme's operationalization of that variable. And we used the value of India as the high level of gender inequality. And the low level of gender inequality was that of the United States. Again, it's all relative, right? There's certainly strong arguments to be made that the United States struggles in many ways with gender equality. And then samples of predominantly men are represented in blue, samples of predominantly women are represented in orange. What you can see here is that the relationship is always positive. So increasing self-efficacy is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be quite limited in its effects, and it can be potentially a waste of effort, especially among marginalized populations, because what we see is the values hit relatively low levels. That's a pretty low correlation, which is of approximately 0.11 or 0.1 for samples of women in India. So thinking about and prioritizing the development of self-efficacy is not a bad thing, but it's not enough in an entrepreneurial context. And the focus on self-starting, future thinking, and overcoming barriers really becomes the priority. Because instead of viewing this process of skill development, goal setting, and psychological empowerment as something that we as stakeholders can directly influence, I believe it's more proper to think about it as something that we can facilitate in the entrepreneurs themselves. And if given the right amount of autonomy and given the right amount of support, they can engage through the principles of personal initiative training, which, in another lens, kind of translate to proactivity, innovativeness, and persistence. If you can capacitate proactivity and innovativeness and persistence, that very well might have more bang for the buck from both a theoretical standpoint and from a theoretical standpoint, from an evidential standpoint, and certainly, I think from a human capability standpoint, I think that should be our emphasis, is the capacitation, the adding of capacity for entrepreneurs to empower themselves. So empowerment is not something that's bestowed on them; it's instead enabled by us as stakeholders. And of course, we know that. Like we all are cognizant of best practices in international development, but it's a subtle mind shift that you can easily slip back into not grasping and not fully implementing into a program that you're engaged with. So I just wanted to kind of follow on from Michael Frase's research and his great example of the work that he's been doing, and just put an exclamation mark on how radical of a shift that can be. And I think there's nothing inherent about PI itself. It's really about the emphasis on allowing the entrepreneur to empower themselves and then giving them the tools not to solve the problems for them, but to allow them to be able to solve those problems for themselves. Again, a somewhat prosaic and common sense notion, but ultimately I think it's the secret of many successful efforts to empower innovators and entrepreneurs, those that are themselves seeking to change their environments around them. And that completes my presentation. Thank you very much.